and welcome to Relationships in Progress with me, Ingrid Sthare, and our special guest today, which I'm looking forward to introducing. Relationships in Progress is a podcast about relationships in progress. As I continue to look for the love of my life, I speak with relationship experts as well as experts in their field about relationships and how you can learn to have better relationships, have a better sex life, have a better romantic life, have a better family life across the board. So I'm thrilled today to introduce Dr. Alex Korb. He is an adjunct professor at UCLA. He got his Ph.D. in neuroscience from UCLA, his undergrad from Brown, and he is the author of, and I want to get the entire title, the author of The Upward Spiral, Reversing the Course of Depression, One Small Change at a Time. His blog is also on his website, which is Alex Korb, spelled Korb, PhD.com. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'm so excited that you're here. I had met you actually on a Facebook page that you have, and I was studying neuroscience when I was becoming a coach myself. So not the kind of neuroscience a PhD would study. So I'm excited to pick your brain about what happens to us. Let's start at the beginning. We'll start off soft. What happens to us when we start to fall in love? What are some of the chemicals that are happening?
Yeah, well, when you first start to fall in love, it really gets the dopamine system really engaged. I mean, that's like early on in the process when you're really attracted to someone. Basically, humans are really social animals. And we need each other, and we need to be able to form close relationships in order to survive. And nature sort of figured out, like, oh, well, we can just reuse some brain circuits that were good for other stuff and just make it so that people, enjoy being around each other and want to form close relationships, and make it so that it's scary and painful to experience rejection, because we already had brain circuits that made it enjoyable to like find good food, or to like get scared about being separated from the tribe, or to experience pain. And our relationships sort of map onto those circuits. And really, when we first start falling in love, it's very similar to when you get addicted to something. You have a reward center in your brain that when you see the person, or when you get that text back from them, that you've been waiting for, like you just get this little boost of dopamine in the reward circuit, and that feels really energizing and activating. But when you don't get it, like when you see the three dots, for example, in the text, and then they don't send it, you can actually have these feelings of dysphoria and lack of pleasure, because you don't get that burst of dopamine, and then you feel even worse. So it can really have these highs and lows.
And speaking of lows, isn't it the lows of the serotonin that keeps us kind of overly focused, so it's harder for us to sleep, kind of thing, when we're falling in love?
Yeah, I mean, serotonin is this whole other molecule. I'm not sure if you misspoke, or you're also talking about the serotonin, because the dopamine and serotonin interact, and they're really both important for our well-being. But yeah, like when dopamine gets involved, it really focuses our attention on something. And that's really important when you're first, getting together with someone. Your thoughts are about them. It's sort of rewarding to think about them. And it's really stressful to think, they, might break up with me or not. And we can have these wild swings. Like I remember when I first started dating my wife, she didn't like texting that much. And I was like, reading everything into each response and how long it was. And I remember telling my friend, like, I started dating this girl and she's amazing. Like, we have these great conversations, and like, I can't tell, if she's like totally in love with me, or like if she doesn't really like me at all. And he was like, yeah, I'm sure it's one of those two options. But that's like dopamine really gets us on this high. And then when we don't get it, when on these lows, and our stress system gets involved, which activates all of our emotional circuitry, and that contributes actually to the highs feeling really high and the lows feeling really low. And
so is that more, I want to know this for my clients too, because
yeah.
that's what I learned, is that your dopamine goes up and your serotonin when you're falling in love. Now, when it changes when you're in love, and
Mm-hmm.
and our chemicals are supposed to change for that homeostasis and that
Right.
more stability, right? So
Yeah.
the serotonin is going down, and that's what keeps us focused, and it's harder for us to sleep. Is that accurate?
Right. Well, serotonin is involved in like delay of gratification. Serotonin is like a mood stabilizer that helps to smooth out some of the rust patches of dopamine, because like the way the dopamine system works, it's like a spoiled child. Like, when it doesn't get exactly what it wants right now, then it like throws a temper tantrum, and that's how your emotional circuitry works. And the serotonin system is much more involved in the prefrontal cortex, which is the sort of most advanced part of the brain. I've conveniently gone bald over my prefrontal cortex to illustrate. I have a very large prefrontal cortex, as you can tell, and it's growing. But the like the prefrontal cortex helps us, keep our long-term goals in mind. Like, oh, it's okay, maybe this one won't work out, but I'll keep dating and it'll work. And then that sort of helps calm us and soothe us down. But the emotional circuitry in our brain like doesn't want to hear that. Like, no, if I can't fall in love right now, then everything's terrible and awful. And like, if I can fall in love right now, that's great. And so like, yes, when we are in that sort of heightened state of stress and arousal, then our actions and our focus are driven a lot more by these sort of deeper, older regions, like the reward circuitry or the emotional circuitry, and aren't guided as much by the sort of thoughtful, intentional prefrontal circuitry.
You mentioned prefrontal cortex, so it's developing until we're 25, 26 years of age. Is
Mm-hmm.
falling in love different when we are younger than it is when we are older? Has there been any link to that?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, yes. I don't know how rigorously that specifically has been studied, but I would say yes, because so much changes as we get older. For one, we know that, at least like when it comes to dopamine, the newness of something causes greater release of dopamine. And so that's why we always talk about, your first kiss, you'll never forget your first kiss, or the first time you fell in love, because like that's the first, it's new. You don't know anything at all of what to experience. That heightens your stress, but it also heightens your reward. And there's nothing inherently wrong with stress. Stress is also another way of looking at excitement or anticipation. And so the first time that you're falling in love, there's maximal excitement and maximal anticipation, and that tends to happen when we're younger. But on top of that, when we're younger, we also have these new hormones that are pulsing through us that we don't fully understand, and that have a stronger control over our brains and our bodies. And then on top of that, the prefrontal cortex, which sort of provides this calming aspect to our lives, like isn't fully isn't fully formed. And so that when you're a teenager, your early 20s, like, well, the highs are really high and the lows are really low. And sometimes that can be addicting because the highs are even higher given that the lows are so low, which makes us, wanting to keep pursuing and come back for more. And as we get older, things can mellow out a little bit. And I think sometimes people misunderstand relationships. They misinterpret their own relationships because they're comparing everything to how it felt when they were younger. And you could miss out on something great because, like, guess what? Like, nothing is really going to feel similar to the experience of like your first crush, getting to kiss your first crush in high school. But like, that's okay. Like, no amusement park that you go to now is going to compare to your first time going to Disneyland or what, and in fact, I think sometimes it might also be that we remember the, times as being better before, because we remember only the highest highs and we forget about the low, terrible things. So I think, and sometimes it's just a trick of the way our memories work, that we're telling ourselves that it was so much greater back then. But yeah, as you get older, you can still experience those things, and you can still experience those tingles, but oftentimes we sort of adult our way out of these feelings. Like, as our prefrontal cortex gets more developed, we sort of live our lives in a more logical, structured ways, which is helpful. But in some ways, we suck a lot of the fun and enjoyment out of it, which is not a necessary process, although it tends to, as our habits build up over time, we can sometimes lose some of that magic. And sometimes falling in love is learning to allow yourself to experience those deep feelings like you allowed yourself when you were younger.
Excellent. Thank you. And that's why myself as a relationship expert and other people also talk about how important novelty is in long-term relationships, that injecting novelty and exploration is so important. Can you talk a little bit about exploration circuitry as we get older, learning new things, and how important that is to have new experiences with somebody that we have a long-term relationship with?
Right. Yeah. Well, like, dopamine is, as I've mentioned already, is like the chemical that gives us that little boost of reward. And it is enhanced when things are new, or when they are uncertain, or when we're stressed out. And all of those things happen when you first meet someone, or it's during your first relationship. Because when you don't know somebody really well, like, you can't tell, like, are they flirting with me, or are they just kind of dismiss me or whatever? And it's actually that uncertainty that makes it more enticing. When you've been with someone for 6 months or a year or longer, you kind of get this sense that you know them, you know how they're going to respond, you have a greater predictability about them, and that reduces some of the dopamine. And that's just sort of a natural part of a relationship becoming deeper, is that you do understand someone. And that's also something that leads people to think that there's something wrong with the relationship that they're in, because it's not as exciting and heart-pounding as it was at the beginning. Well, yeah, because you're more familiar with them. It's transferring from more of direct reward circuitry, dopamine, to a deeper oxytocin and and broad-based dopamine activity throughout the brain. So you have a deeper relationship where you feel more comforted and connected. Yeah, there's not always as much excitement, but that is sort of why, as you mentioned, it's important to explore and try new things together, so that you still get to, experience some excitement and titillation in your life, but also that you see your partner in different and new experiences and contexts, because your partner starts to get more dull when you think you know exactly how they're going to respond to everything. And if you go to a new restaurant together, or you go to a new national park together, well, then each of you gets to experience the other person in this new context, in this new environment, and that helps to keep the spark alive. But on top of that, new experiences just on an individual level helps us grow as a person. And so if your partner is growing as a person and becoming a different person, well, then they're always continually a new person for you to discover. And that is why it can be so important for keeping that relationship fresh.
That's excellent. And even as I recommended, even a small change, even if you normally go to Starbucks, for example, to go to a different coffee shop can be something that helps you to refresh the relationship. So we talked a little bit about the beginning of relationships, and we are supposed to ease on into this more relaxed brain state. So the average divorce in the United States is actually 8 years. And we talk about the 7-year itch.
Mm-hmm.
I've understood it to be chemical wise, and I'm so glad I get to ask a neuroscientist. 4 years, 2 to 4 years is when the brain chemicals start evening out. Tell me what your thoughts are on that. Where we get more relaxed in the relationship, and we start feeling more safe, which is, part of it in order to form family units and nuclear families and so on. We start feeling more of that trusting. I know this person now.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know exactly. There's not like a clear cutoff, but I think like the biggest transition, I think, is probably in after the first few months, where you go from anticipating or wondering about whether this person is going to respond or not, and you're excited and you're doing almost everything you do is new with each other, and you get a lot of this dopamine immediate rewards. And then as time progresses, after the first 6 months or so, you start deepening your relationship to the point where oxytocin gets more involved. And that's this chemical that helps us feel closer and more connected to people. And that actually helps to reduce stress. And because it reduces stress, well, then your dopamine isn't firing as much as possible. So you feel deeper and calmer with the person, but they might not, be as, get your heart racing quite as much. And that's, as I said, that's when sometimes people think, oh, this relationship is just losing its flame. Like, no, it's deepening. It's becoming something different. And I think what happens is that we don't just deepen our relationship with each other. We also fall into habits, personal habits and relationship habits. And habits also can be calming in a way, but sometimes we feel like we get stuck in our habits. And habits are kind of like autopilot. Autopilot in a plane is really helpful, because you can focus on something else for a while and yet still move towards your destination. And think about like how all encompassing your relationship was in the first 3 months or 6 months. You couldn't focus on getting work done. You couldn't focus on these other things. Like if your whole life was that first 3 months of a relationship, it would be really hard to get a lot done at work. And as your relationship progresses, it allows you to feel close and connected to this person, but still focus on other important things in your life. But if you fall into too much of a rut, then you start to take your relationship for granted, and you start to take this other person for granted. And your brain is really good at this. It's sort of like whatever good thing in your life, it's very naturally sort of starts taking it for granted, and we stop paying attention to it because we're like, that's always going to be there. And I start focusing on other exciting new things. But then if it's a person that you're taking for granted, well, how's that going to make them feel? But also, you're going to stop focusing on the positive things about them, and you're just going to focus on, oh, well, I have to really work late, and oh, now my girlfriend is, bothering me, and she's getting in the way of me doing this thing. And then we start to look at our spouses as, or our partner as someone who's just getting in the way of these other things that are important to us, and our habits and our relationship habits just start to get in the way, quote unquote, of these other things that are important to us. When in fact, it's helpful to remember that, oh no, we've allowed ourselves to fall into an autopilot that's taking us in a direction that we don't want to go, or we've forgotten that, no, this partner isn't getting in the way of some important goals. They are the way. They are my important goals. I want to have a deeper relationship, and that takes focus and effort. I can't just ignore it for 2 years or 5 years and expect that it will always be there.
So let me make a quick leap, and then I really want to talk about your book and your course that you're doing.
Yeah.
Quick leap is there any neuroscience behind infidelity?
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting stuff. There's one of the coolest things is this this research into a rodent species called the vole. And vole, like, I think they're kind of like prairie dogs or moles or something. And yeah, and so there's two types. There's the prairie voles, I think, and the montane voles, the ones that live in the plains, the ones that live in the mountains. I can't remember which is which exactly, but one of them is monogamous. They only have one partner, the prairie voles. And the montane voles, they just, have multiple partners, but they're basically the same species. And scientists noticed that one specific chemical receptor is different between them, and it's called the vasopressin receptor, which is analogous to oxytocin. It's basically a very similar structure, has a similar receptor. And this is the thing that helps us feel like close and connected to others. And if you don't have this receptor, or you don't have as much of it, then it's harder to feel that close and connection. If you don't feel a close connection with someone, then why would you go through all the trouble of continuing to go to that person when you could get more dopamine somewhere else? And I think that's sort of an analogy that works in humans as well, because there's, in humans it's not as black or white, but there's studies that shown that women with certain genes for a particular vasopressin receptor are more likely to cheat than women with another set of genes. And it's not, it's not a black or white thing. It's just that, oh, well, if you have this, vasopressin receptor particular format, then it's less likely that you'll form as deep an attachment, and therefore the dopamine burst that you would get from some new face or, tall drink of water that walked in the door, that might make you change your actions. There's also research about how men who have certain changes in their dopamine system are more likely to be promiscuous or cheat, because we all need a little bit of dopamine and excitement in our lives. And if your brain is really insensitive to dopamine, then you need a big burst to get a sufficient amount. And so how do you get a big burst of dopamine? Well, you find a new partner. You hook up with someone new. There's a lot of uncertainty, they're new. Or you do something a little dangerous, like cheating. You might get caught. How having, an affair outside of your relationship is like really stressful, and that enhances the dopamine of it. And therefore, like if you're someone who needs that thrill to get the dopamine, then it's likely that you can get bored perhaps of a relationship that you're in and want to seek your thrills elsewhere. So you have to be really mindful of keeping your relationship fresh.
Thank you for that. Is it, because we're switching over, we're going to move over to your expertise in neuroscience, is very much about depression. True?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
no, I got a PhD in neuroscience of depression, trying to understand what's happening in the brain and what we can do about it. And that's sort of why I started looking at relationships more, because relationships are one of the biggest factors that help rescue us from depression, but also because they're so important to us, if they go wrong or feel like we can't connect with people, well, then that can sort of plunge us into depression.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons I definitely wanted to talk to you, is there a difference before we go head on into, we don't have too much more time either. And I wish I had 3 hours to talk to you. So is there a difference in the brain between depression and loneliness? Because loneliness is starting to become something that we're really watching in this field of relationships.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap, but depression is a very complex thing because, and a lot of people misunderstand it. They think depression is just like feeling sad all the time. But there's a lot of other stuff. Yeah, sometimes people don't even feel sad all the time. They just sort of feel this emptiness where emotion should be. Or you can feel guilty or ashamed, and you have trouble sleeping, and you have trouble enjoying things. Loneliness, might make you feel down, or what we colloquially would call depressed. But it's just sort of, I'd say, for someone who truly has depression, like it's just sort of the edge of falling into that downward spiral of depression. And it's just that if you are lonely, then you're much more likely to get stuck in that downward spiral, particularly if you are someone who, is very self-critical, or you don't have a lot of other great stuff that you enjoy in your life, or, you really, need to feel close and connected to other people in order to be happy. So loneliness isn't always going to precipitate depression, but it is a big risk factor because social connection is so important in helping us create an upward spiral and sustain our well-being.
So it's interesting you say that. People can be the cause of depression, and they are also the cure for depression and loneliness. Tell me a little bit. So I was grateful that you had offered a course in regards to the upward spiral, and I took the course, and it was an online course for several weeks when quarantine had just started. You were playing around with it, trying to figure out what to do, and now it's become a successful course.
I created a webinar like when the quarantine sort of in the pandemic first hit. I was like, I feel like I should share some of this helpful neuroscience with people. And so I should create this webinar, The Upward Spiral for Managing Stress, just sort of as like a quick little simple thing that, people can understand about their brain. And then from that, I was like, oh, well, clearly there's a lot of interest in this. And from that, I created the Upward Spiral core program, which is a longer course to really get a deep dive in all of these things that you can do to change your brain activity for the better.
So we know about positivity ratio, that for every one negative thought, you need 3 to kind of neutralize it and 5 to really outdo it. So I would like to know what you would give us as 5 suggestions of what we can do as individual people. And if it bleeds over into relationships, maybe that's my final question for you, is how can you help us get out of it before we register for your next class, which is next month, I want to say? Is it next month?
Yeah. Well, I try and do it. I'm not sure exactly when the next one is, but yes, we'll make that announcement soon. If people go to alexkorbphd.com, then they can stay up to date. The Yeah, I mean, that positivity ratio, I think, is sort of helpful as a metaphor to understand that, like, oh, sometimes when you have certain expectations, then one piece of negative information can really impact you much more strongly than a similar piece of positive information. And particularly if you are an emotional person. And while I don't think that specific ratio of, oh, like, 3-to-1 or 5-to-1 is the same for everyone, it's helpful to realize that sometimes negative information, like losing $100, can impact you a lot more than, say, finding $100 makes you feel good. And just recognizing about that, about yourself, the asymmetry there can be helpful.
I love that you do that. I want to interject because that comes from Dr. Fredrickson's work, positivity, the 3-to-1 ratio, and then the 5 to really outdo it. So a lot of times when we're learning, for those of us who aren't PhDs in neuroscience, we're learning generalities. And what I love about talking to you is you get into the nuance of, well, it's not exact. And the more I've learned about neuroscience, I explain the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And I'm like, it's not really that your whole prefrontal cortex goes off. So you're really good at kind of getting into the nuance of, it's different for people. It's not like hard to find fact, this thing and that kind of stuff. It's for the nuance of individual people. I love that.
Yeah. And that's where it, like, people, science can sometimes do a disservice, because the purpose of science is to, like, one of the main purposes and the first goals is to, like, understand how people work, or, like, to understand how the brain works. And one of the things we've started to understand is that, okay, there's a lot of principles that sort of explain how the human brain works. But then there are also places where every individual person is different. So that doesn't mean, and sometimes people will go too far to that end, but, oh, well, everyone's different. Science can't tell us anything. It's like, no, science can tell us a lot. Like, we all have the human brain, but there is a limit to where, we can do a study on 20 people with, relationship troubles and 20 people without, and average them together and see sort of what the differences are. But, like, you are not 20 people. You are one individual person with your own specific life experiences, your own specific tuning of all these different brain circuits. You have a specific tuning of your reward circuit and of your, memory circuit, and your pain circuit, and your relationship circuit. And all these things are interacting with the specific life that you are living. And by actually understanding the science, you can start to use it to recognize patterns in your own life and realize, oh, what parts of me, or what feelings am I feeling are, like, totally predictable, just given that, like, that's how the human brain works. And, like, what parts of my experience are, like, oh, like, kind of unique to myself, just because of my own life experiences, my own specific habits, my own coping habits, or my own, work environment or whatever. And, like, learning to separate those out, I think, helps us get a better understanding of ourselves, and what it takes to make not just a generic person happy, but what specifically for me at this point in my life does it take to make me happy? Because there's no scientific study about this specific moment in your life, but we can learn a lot from all the scientific studies that examine different types of people in different situations.
Thank you. I'm going to shift just real quick. I promise this is the last question. wish I could do this for 3 hours with you, because when we first started talking, before we started recording, we did talk, and I'm really interested in this for men specifically, about testosterone, depression. And we know that since the 1980s, testosterone levels have been decreasing for men. And then since 2000, suicide rates for middle-aged men have been increasing. And I had asked you, is there a correlation between testosterone levels going lower and depression, and therefore perhaps suicide levels too, for men specifically? I really want to hit this for my men.
Yeah. I think what we'd like to know is some simple, really specific explanation of like, oh yeah, oh, your testosterone levels are going down. Or like, oh, well then just get a boost of testosterone. That's going to solve all of your problems. And that's just doesn't seem to be the case. Like that is perhaps a decline in testosterone can contribute to these things, but it's not like the one cause, because if you just increase testosterone, that's not going to solve all of your problems. But when it comes to depression, it does appear that it's different between men and women. And testosterone is likely one factor. But so also is socialization and our social roles. And the question is, how much of that is sort of innate and that we can't control just based on our genetics, and how much of it is based on our society we can't always tease apart. But women tend to get depression at about twice the rate of men. However, there's one good news, is that antidepressant medications tend to work for women about twice the rate as men. So antidepressant medications don't work as well for men. But one of the things that I wanted to look at, I took this big data set and I was trying to do this analysis to see at like, how much does like having a good job and like being productive at your job matter? Because it seems like something that, our society asks men more of men, that like, they be the provider, and whether that's, an outdated notion, I think that's still there's a lot of cultural
Very
baggage
ingrained
to that. Yeah. And so I looked at this data set that was had all these people going for treatment in depression, and it turns out that men who are unemployed did significantly worse with antidepressant medication than unemployed women. So like being unemployed for a man sort of made the antidepressants not work as well as being unemployed for a woman. So yeah, like they're sort of equal levels of depression. But if you were a depressed man who had a job, antidepressants work better for you than if you're a depressed man who doesn't have a job. And
job changes happen in middle age for men, for sure.
Yeah.
So, and Brene Brown talks about, for men, their shame spiral is more weakness, or is weakness.
Yeah.
So to be virile, to be this strong man and doing and achieving, definitely has an effect.
Yeah. And there's another part of the analysis that I did where I looked at, of just the people who have jobs, like how much is their productivity being affected? And if your productivity was being really affected by the depression, that didn't really affect things at all if you were a woman. Like women who had their job productivity being affected versus not affected, well, they responded about the same rates with antidepressant medication. Whereas men who had their productivity affected at work, they didn't respond to antidepressant medications as well. That there's a certain sense of our well-being for men that's more wrapped up in our ability to be productive and contribute. And I think some of that is related to testosterone, because testosterone, it doesn't, from all the research I've studied, it doesn't make us like more aggressive or competitive. Like it makes us want to win and succeed in whatever environment that we are in. So if the environment that you're in requires that you be violent to win or be aggressive, then testosterone is going to make you more violent or more competitive. If the environment that you're in requires you to be, you know, more cooperative, well, then testosterone can make you be more cooperative. It's very flexible. But I think a lot of the messages that we get from society as men are saying like, well, if you're not contributing or being productive, then you're not as valuable, and therefore not having a job or not being as productive, and it can have a greater effect on our well-being. And I think when you combine that with the fact that boys and men aren't taught to recognize these feelings or deal with these feelings in more constructive ways, then they can sort of get stuck in that.
I hate that I have to end this now, but we are so over time. My clients will know that this is normal for me, that I generally don't watch clocks. And so producer Steve makes me watch the clock, and I'm like watching it and I'm like, oh my God, this is so interesting. My battery is going low. This is so interesting that I just want to keep going on with this, because I'd love to have you back on sometime to talk about, you know, again, to really continue to talk about this and flesh this out so that we can give people really good information so that they don't feel so alone and out there just, I wonder why this is happening to me. I wonder why this isn't responding for me.
Yeah.
So,
and the frustration in not being able to like share all this great stuff in, you know, half an hour is exactly why I wrote 2 books about the upward spiral, and why I was like, oh, I should record some of this or create like a brief webinar so that people can learn some of this in a few hours. And I was like, oh, clearly some people want to benefit and want to learn a bit more deeper. And that's why I created the Upward Spiral core program. There's like a whole course that people can take a deep dive into this stuff.
thank you for saying that. Thank you for being on. It was such a pleasure, and we all probably learned a lot. I enjoyed your being here and being present and talking about, you know, from various different things. And I have all these pages of notes, and guess how many of them I actually have? None. So I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you again so much for being here. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me and allowing me to share with your audience.
Thank you.